Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the Grant Professionals Association's webinar titled From a Reviewer's Perspective, What Can Make or Break a Proposal? My name is Kelly Romero, and I am the GPA Membership Director and your webinar moderator. At the end of the webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey. We ask that you please fill it out to assist us with future webinars. Let's get started. Today's presenter is Scott Herr. Scott has an extensive experience in coordinating and managing federal and state grant-funded programs, including experience with the Clinical Trials Network Division of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Title I programs, and programs funded through targeted assistance for needy families. Her's professional experience also includes service as a peer reviewer for competitive grants for the United States Department of Education, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, the Administration for Children and Families, and AmeriCorps. Herr serves as a grant writer for Catholic Charities Diocese of Toledo, developing funding proposals to support a wide range of programs, and as technical assistance project manager for Just Right Solutions, which provides technical assistance, grantsmanship, and leadership support to nonprofits. You are placed in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat box on the left side of your screen to submit all of your questions. We will get to as many questions as time permits at the end of the webinar. Scott, please feel free to begin your webinar. We might have lost Scott. I don't hear him. If any of you can hear me, can you place an answer saying that you can hear me in the chat box? Scott, please dial *7 if you can to unmute yourself.
Okay, do we have me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you so much.
Okay, not a problem. Sorry about that technical glitch there. All right, we'll get started here. I want to go over, I'm going to break this presentation down into 4 parts, and we're going to look at the common mistakes that grant writers, or grant reviewers rather, often cite as reasons for deducting points from proposals. Then we'll also look at whether or not you as an organization or the organization you're writing for is a good fit for the grant maker. We'll go section by section and give a little advice as far as how you can organize those sections to make them a little more appealing to reviewers and common mistakes that are made in those. And then we'll also talk about proposal readability and presentation. I'll give some advice there as far as how to make your proposals more readable for your reviewers. And then I've got a couple of examples then too of some proposals that I've reviewed that we'll look at, and I'll point out some of the mistakes that we found in those. So, moving right along here, some of the more common mistakes that reviewers often cite when they look at grant proposals is that the writing style is just very vague or unfocused. They also state that sections do not flow together well, and that all of your proposed activities are not supporting a need that you stated, or there's not much alignment between sections. That's a big issue. For instance, if you state one main need for your project and you list maybe 4 or 5 activities, if all of those activities aren't lining up with that need or addressing that need, then you might have a problem. And it's also very apparent too, whenever I've reviewed for grants, when you have multiple writers working on that project and they didn't take the time to clean it up and polish it, it's really pretty obvious that you had different writers working on different sections, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can confuse your reviewers a little bit, and it can especially become problematic if all of those sections, again, don't align very well. Another complaint that you'll often hear is that the writing style itself just feels very academic. It almost reads like a research journal. And we'll talk a little later on when we're talking about improving readability, how that can be a problem. Providing too much data, that can actually be a bad thing. You don't want to confuse your writers by burying them in data. You just need to provide what is relevant to the proposal or the project that you're requesting funds for. Incomplete responses. I see this happen often when there are questions that have multiple parts to them, where you might have one question, but they're really asking you 3 or 4. It's just really important to make sure that you're addressing every question that's being asked. Oftentimes I'll see applications that will actually just completely skip a question that's buried within another question, or they just might skip a question altogether if they don't think they can answer it. My best advice is, if you're not sure how to answer something, contact the grant maker and find out what it is they're looking for, but skipping it can result in the loss of many points. Sloppy mistakes. I'd love to say that I don't see this very often, but I do. An example of a sloppy mistake might be when you have copied from another proposal that you've written and just pasted it into the one that you're working on now, and maybe forget to edit out the other foundation's name. So that's kind of obvious and maybe even borderline offensive sometimes. And then, of course, the big one is just not following directions. When the grant makers put their guidelines together, they really want you to follow those instructions. And specifically, if they're asking for certain types of data, like maybe census data or something, and you don't include that, and you give them data from maybe a local survey or something, that might not be, you might not get credit for that. And what this oftentimes, these sorts of mistakes will oftentimes result in, is just creating a lot of confusion and frustration, aggravation for your reviewers. You often end up overwhelming your reviewers with a lot of unneeded information that they have to sift through and try to make connections for themselves. You never want to make reviewers search for information. So if you're creating a situation where you're burying them with data or information that they don't need, you're going to have them flipping back and forth between pages, and that can just really make scoring very difficult for your reviewers, and finding the right information difficult. And it also does cast a little doubt on your own credibility then too, as an agency or an organization. So what we're going to talk about next then is how we can avoid some of these common mistakes and actually try to score where we can in these sections with the reviewers. First and foremost, it's important just to make sure that you're a good fit for the funder that you're going after. A lot of times funders might be limited to certain geographic areas, and so you want to make sure that you are matched up with that, as opposed to not being matched up and spending a lot of time developing a proposal that won't even get reviewed. You want to make sure that your grant maker's interests are going to be the same as the area that you're wanting to be funded in, and what you don't want to do is try to stretch whatever you are doing to meet a specific interest of the funder, because even if you succeed at getting it reviewed, getting your proposal reviewed, usually in the process of review, or sometimes in the process following review, where the funder might want to meet with you and either talk over the phone or face-to-face about the project a little bit more in detail, that's when it will kind of flush out that your project is an exact fit. And if you're uncertain, again, just be sure to contact the potential grant maker and ask them if you're a good fit or not. A lot of times you see different types of support being provided through grants for different projects. General support, operational support, program-specific, capacity building, capital improvements, matching. Some grant makers may choose to only fund new projects, or some may only choose to fund existing projects. So just make sure that whatever it is you're trying to get funded matches whatever type of support that grant maker wants to, what kind of project they want to support. It's also a good idea to get a good feel for what the award range might be too from that grant maker. Most federal applications will give you some idea of what the award range is going to be. Private foundations may not be so transparent with that information, in which case you can look up a 990 or their 990 forms to get kind of a history of what their giving is like. And if you're unsure on where to find those are available through the Foundation Center's website, and if you don't have a membership there, you can actually go to the National Center for Charitable Statistics, and they have a free 990 finder there, which actually ties into the Foundation Center's database. But by pulling those up, those provide a listing of what organizations that foundation might have provided support to and for what amount in any given year. So you can pull up years worth of those and get an idea of what a request might, or what a reasonable request might be for that funder. And now we're just going to look section by section at the major sections of a proposal and get a feel for where some of the common mistakes are in those sections and how you can avoid some of those. So let's look first. Actually, before I get to needs, let's look at a few points to consider for all of these sections. One thing that you want to remember is to consider the expertise level of your reviewers. I've participated in reviews for about 10 years for the federal government through either the Departments of Education, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, and the Office of, I think it's Children and Family Services or something along that line. But most of those departments all have similar processes where they'll have a panel of 3 experts who are participating in the review process. And of those 3, they usually have one person who has worked within the field that these programs are being funded to serve, and they might be experienced for they might have 10 or 20 years worth of experience. They usually also have a professional who's outside the field who might just be experienced in administration or in research and evaluation. And then a lot of times, more recently at least, they're starting to recruit graduate students in on this too. So you'll have a range of experience from folks who are just starting graduate school to 20 years of professional service that you need to convince to fund your project. So take that into consideration when you are writing all of these sections, and make sure that they are written for any range of professional in terms of experience to be able to understand. Also taking into consideration then how much time reviewers actually spend reading your proposals. A lot of people are surprised if you've worked in grant writing but you've not done any reviewing. You know how much time we put into these proposals. I mean, you can spend weeks and weeks developing something, but reviewers typically spend maybe 60 to 90 minutes on a proposal, reviewing that and commenting and scoring. Typically what I've seen in the departments that I've worked with, the way it usually works out is that your panel will get assigned maybe 12 applications to review and have them all scored, commented on, and then participate in a couple of conference calls to discuss this all within about 10 days. So what it usually breaks down to then is they're actually putting in about 60 to 90 minutes for each proposal. So they're not reading these things in depth. They usually are kind of skimming through and looking for the answers. So you want to make this stuff stand out as much as possible to them. Also consider then that consider that your proposal is one of many that they're going to be looking at, especially with federal applications and with funding being scarce as it is right now. Federal funding sources are getting more applications than they have in the past, so more people are fighting for the same dollars, and you're just going to be competing amongst even more agencies to get funded. And this is kind of a sad fact, but more than half the proposals that are actually submitted in the grant-making process usually don't even get to the review level because they didn't follow simple formatting instructions, they didn't meet the eligibility criteria, or they just didn't follow all the guidelines. So they put a lot of time and effort into getting that grant application package put together, and it literally just goes in the dumpster and never gets reviewed. So now moving on to the need statement, you want to be as clear and concise as possible in your explanation. In this section, you need to describe the problem to your reviewers, and you want to do this in relation to the target population that you want to serve, not to your own organization. You want to describe the problem that you intend to resolve through this proposal, and it's also important, too, to try to give a sense of the breadth and scope of the problem, too. Explain to your reviewers why there is a need, why does it exist, and what are the things that contribute to it. And then what are the existing gaps or barriers that are preventing people maybe from getting a certain type of service or that are causing them to experience a certain type of problem. But the trick is that you want to make sure that you're identifying that underlying problem. And you need to provide supporting evidence. It isn't just enough to state that there is a problem, but show your reviewers with relevant data that there is a problem. And I say relevant, and I also mean reputable too. Use reputable data sources. Census information. The U.S. Census Bureau is a great website to pull this information from. And you want to get it as close to the local level as possible unless the grant maker specifies otherwise. You also want to provide some anecdotal evidence if it's appropriate for that application. Sometimes it isn't always appropriate, but when you do provide it, use that as a supplement to the quantitative data, but not as a replacement. Your reviewers are really looking for some way to measure the problem, if you will. So if you're just giving anecdotal information, you're not really giving them a sense of how big the problem is. So be sure to use the anecdotal as just a supplement if you use that. And then, of course, just avoid using irrelevant information. And again, this would be where you're burying your reviewers with more information than they need. An example that I can think of off the top of my head is I was doing some review work for a physical education program for the Carol White grant, and we had one application a couple of years ago that came through that literally they gave us about 2 pages worth of, well, it was one table that was about 2 pages long and provided every piece of measurable data that you could ever want on children at that grade level, including the physical education standards, their achievement in different subject areas, risk factors. Just, it was like they pulled the information straight out the Youth Risk Behavior survey and plopped it into there, and really we only needed about 3 or 4 pieces of that data, but they gave us 2 pages and we had to sift through it, and that's kind of difficult to make sense of when you've got 10 more or 11 other applications aside from that one to try to review. Also describe, again, in describing your target population or beneficiaries, it's important that you describe how they're going to benefit, because the grant maker is interested in knowing what the impact is going to be on the population you're serving, not on you. So if there's, maybe if you need a technology upgrade or something for your organization, describe that in terms of how that affects the population you're serving. Does that make the service delivery more efficient, more expedient? Can you serve more people if you get better technology? But what you don't want to do is put it in terms of the benefit to the organization and how great that's going to be for your organization. You need to keep in mind that they're more interested in what the impact is going to be for the service. You also want to avoid circular reasoning. Something to keep in mind is that the lack of your solution is not actually your problem. And a good example that I found here is that If there's no public pool in your community, building a public pool will solve that problem. Well, it's not really a good need statement. What you might want to provide then instead of that information as a good justification is building a case that the absence of having recreational opportunities available to youth in your community might cause other problems. And so if you can provide data related to other problems or other activities youth might be engaging in that might be alleviated if you have the public pool, then you can build a better case for supporting that need, or at least demonstrating there's a need for a better recreational outlet for youth. And now let's move on to project description. The best way to think of this section is to really look at this as kind of the recipe for your project. You want to make sure that you're listing all of your ingredients, if you will, in this section. This section really needs to provide a description that's going to tell the reader how all of these things that you need for the project are going to be combined together to create your project and yield the results that you expect. If I read through a description section, I expect to be able to have complete understanding of what it is the applicant intends to do, how they're going to do it, and how that's going to support accomplishing all of their goals and objectives. And it should make sense. This should all link together, and I shouldn't have questions afterwards. This section needs to tell your reviewers what it is that you expect to accomplish. You should have clear goals and objectives in this section. Your goals need to address the stated needs, and the objectives need to align with those goals then. This is very important that these things line up, because if you have goals that are stated in there that don't really relate to a need, then your reviewers are going to wonder why it is that you want to achieve these certain things if there doesn't seem to be a purpose. One of the things that I do when I review for some of these federal programs is to actually lay out a spreadsheet, and I'll, in one column, create, I'll list what the needs are that the applicant stated, and then the next column over I'll list what their objectives are that they stated, and line up the activities, etc. So there should be a nice match between all of those things, but that's how I can usually weed out activities that aren't even supporting a goal to address a need. And when those become apparent, that's when applicants start losing points. Back to project description then. This should also tell the readers how and when they're going to accomplish certain things. You should provide a good description of your activities too, and in that description, tell your reader why it is that you chose the activities you did. Are you choosing them because they're research or evidence-based? If not, is it something that you've been doing in practice that you're trying to increase your capacity to do more of? And if it isn't research or evidence-based, then what evidence do you have that it works? Is it appropriate for your situation or your population? If you research some kind of new curriculum that you decide you want to implement in your school, how do you know that that curriculum is going to work in your school? Is there any kind of indication or any research out there that says that this curriculum has been tested with this group and you know that group matches your students, so it should be okay? That's important to know, and I've actually seen a couple of education grants where they really do ask in specific detail that reviewers consider whether or not that information is there. So it's always important when you're talking about some kind of intervention and you're using research or evidence-based models to justify why you chose that and provide some kind of rationale as to why that's going to work with your group too. You should also talk about your organizational capacity a little bit and provide information about your staffing levels, the experience of your staff and the organization working as far as working with large federal grants goes or working with certain types of services that you're proposing goes? Does your organization or any of your staff have recognition for doing similar work that you're proposing? And do you have any collaboration with other organizations, or do you intend to collaborate with other organizations? I'm kind of a visual person, so when I review, I like to see things like tables and bullet points and timelines kind of spelled out for me. This is a good place where you want to put your timelines, and you can format those in either bullet points or tables, or however it's best to set up in terms of what the grant guidelines are and what works for you too with limited space. But it's important that you spell out certain timelines for how you're going to implement your project or your program too, so the reviewer can clearly see how your program or your project is going to start, and what the certain milestones are that you intend to achieve. And again, I mentioned how activities need to be connected to your objectives. And it's a good thing to know your best practices too. If you're, depending on what area you're proposing to do service in, it's good that you're up to date on everything, and maybe even include references to that, depending on how specific these grant guidelines are that you're working on. Mention what the best practices are in your field and how your project or your proposed program is going to line up with best practices. That gives you a little bit more credibility with the reviewers then too. As an example there, if you want to replace an existing curriculum with a new curriculum, as I mentioned, you need to provide a good rationale as to why you chose that second one, and explain to your reviewers why is this one going to work as opposed to the one that's in place. When we get to evaluation, this is where I often see people kind of drop the ball, I guess, if you would. And the real basic advice that I can give for evaluation is just to set your evaluation plan's framework up based on the objectives that you stated. Your objectives tell the reviewers what it is you want to accomplish. The evaluation plan should be telling your reviewers how you know you're going to measure those things, or how you know you're going to succeed at achieving those things. So they should line up pretty well. And oftentimes what I will often do in my own proposals is set up a table in the evaluation plan and list the objectives in one column, my expected outcomes in another, and then in the third column list what evaluation methodology I'm going to implement to measure the outcomes and what kind of data I collect. And sometimes, depending on the grant maker, sometimes that's sufficient enough for an evaluation plan. But at any rate, you want to make sure that you're looking at all of your objectives and that all of them are being measured, and you're providing some sort of description of the data that you're collecting to the reviewers. And one thing that I also don't see included oftentimes in evaluation plans that I will typically note is there a mechanism included in your evaluation plan to include quality assurance measures? If you put together an evaluation plan and it's a pretty reasonable plan, and you're periodically taking measures on your outcomes and your impacts for your project, but maybe you're not very successful, how are you going to know what is the mechanism going to be for making changes to your program if you need to? That's an important thing to explain in the evaluation plan too, is what do you do with that feedback that you get, or what do you do with those results? And a lot of times I don't see that question addressed, and even if it's not explicitly asked by the grant maker, it's very good to include in there so that they know you're thinking ahead and you're planning to do something with it. And then on to budgets here. What I will tell you as far as budgets go is that I don't think I've ever been in a review setting where the budget itself was included in any of the scoring. That may be different for some programs, but typically the reviewers either don't get that information at all, or if we get it, we're asked not to include it in our comments and certainly not in the scoring. So often what will happen is we will score the narrative sections, and then if the total score meets a certain threshold for funding, it'll be moved on to the next level, and that's a higher level than most grant reviewers are at, and that's, I think, typically the federal department, the office itself is looking at it, and then if they approve it, the budgets will be revised or recommendations will be made to make any changes necessary based on their reviews. So that usually is out of the hands of reviewers, but just to be on the safe side, and since we're not talking completely about federal programs here, and we're including private in this, you do want to make sure that you have an explanation for all of your budget items. And don't include any costs that are not directly supporting some activity within your project. Be sure, too, that you're including all of your costs. So many times I've seen proposals come through that they really haven't thought out all the costs in advance, and it ends up hurting them in the long run. Some common areas people forget about sometimes when you're talking about occupancy costs, they don't always include utilities, rent, or insurance, or maintenance sometimes, if that's a cost that's associated with occupancy. Make sure that your staff, if staff have raises every year, that gets included into your budgets. Things like postage and mileage, they all seem pretty simple, but a lot of times those are overlooked and they can get really costly. And then if your budget form permits this, make sure that you list other secured grant funds. Sometimes they'll even ask you for pending requests too, just to demonstrate that you are looking to support this project in a variety of different ways. Sustainability is one where I think a lot of folks get confused, and I'll tell you that, as a reviewer, we're not typically looking for people to look into a magic ball or crystal ball and tell us what the future is going to be like. If you're applying for a 3-year grant, it's kind of hard to tell the funder exactly what your funding streams are going to look like 3 years from now and what kind of revenue you're going to have to work with to support this program. What they want to see is that you've demonstrated some kind of reasonable understanding of what the costs are going to be like in 3 years and how you can diversify your funding streams over the course of the next 3 years to support that program, or that you're putting some kind of, active thought or planning into how you can continue to support a program. It's important just to make sure that you're being reasonable and not making overestimates in this. An example that I often see sometimes is that people will list fundraising as an area where they tend to inflate things, if you will, to make sure that they meet whatever goal on the income side they need to continue supporting a program. If your fundraising events are typically pulling in $10,000 every year, what you don't want to do is inflate that up to $25,000 without some kind of reasonable explanation to sustain a project. My favorite, and this came from a Department of Ed application, was that we had an applicant who proposed sustaining the project based on bake sales. Well, that would take $250,000 to do, but that's what they listed, and that's kind of unbelievable. So that's generally a no-no. What I would recommend is, went ahead too far there. What I recommend is just try to give examples of how your organization might generate revenue through that program. If you have client fees that are going to be generated through this would be where you want to mention that. If this is a grant to support a startup program, your costs are probably going to be higher the first year than they might be in years 2 or 3. So you can give maybe a second year or provide maybe a second or third year projected budget to show that your expenses are going to be significantly less than in the first year. You can also list examples of your fundraising and grant writing efforts over the past couple of years. You can provide a statement that summarizes something to the effect of our organization has secured 75% of grants that we've sought over the past 3 years. It's just kind of a explanation or example of how you've succeeded at grant writing. So if you are saying in the sustainability statement that you intend on seeking other grants to support this program, provide a timeline maybe for when you're going to propose or when you're going to submit some of those grants, and then give the grant maker an example of what your track record looks like right now. That's a little bit more convincing than just saying that you're going to seek additional funding. Let's look here at some readability tips then too. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, you're working with a wide range of professionals probably in terms of what their expertise level is going to be. So you're going to have grad students on up to professionals in the field who might be published researchers themselves and have 10 or 20 years of experience behind them as your reviewers. So you want to help the reviewers find information quickly. And again, time is working against you too. So what is really, really important is to make sure that you're organizing your proposal sections in the same order that your application is ordered. Your grant reviewers are usually working from either score sheets and or the RFP itself, and using those as tools to evaluate your review or your proposal. So if your proposal is in the same order as the RFP or the guidelines that are provided there, it's going to go a lot easier for them. Use section headers too, and make sure they're the same as the grant guideline headings. That will help your information, or that will help your reviewers locate information a lot faster. And again, we do this. I mention this because we as reviewers will often flip through these things. I typically will flip through a grant application and put post-it notes on the sections or on each new section, and then if there are maybe 6 sections in a grant proposal, I'll hit those 6 pages that I mark and then flip a couple pages forward and backward behind that. But there's a lot of stuff I just don't have time to read. So you don't want the important information to be buried in there. And that being said, every time you start a new section, it's a good idea to discuss in your narrative the points that you're trying to make in order from importance. So start off making your most important point and work through the narrative in order of decreasing importance, and then maybe provide a summary statement at the end of each section, because that's how a lot of times your reviewers are going to read that. Keep your sentences and your paragraphs short. You're not writing, at least in most cases, you're not going to be writing for an academic journal or a research journal. I'm guilty of doing this myself. If I draft a proposal myself, I usually have to go through it a few times and chop the sentences up. I'm that person who will write sentences that are 3 or 4 lines long, and then I can cut them into about 3 or 4 sentences. You want to keep these things short and simple and very clear. Again, your goal here is to make a very clear and convincing case for your reviewers, but you're not trying to impress them with your firm grasp on the English language. I found a tool that I think is very helpful, and I gave you the website link there, and you can put samples of your writing, paste samples of your writing into that tool, and it will tell you what the grade level is, and it'll give you a reading ease score. You want to shoot for about a grade level of 8, believe it or not, and you want your reading ease to be somewhere around 60 to 100. And these are not, die-hard rules or anything like that. I mean, if your grade level is higher and the reading ease is lower, that doesn't mean your reviewers aren't going to be able to, or they're not going to be able to understand it. It just means it's going to be easier to read. In certain fields, you might have higher expectations in terms of the writing style. So it's going to vary, but this is just a good piece of general advice. You want it to be as easy to navigate through as possible. In my experience, proposals stand out for 2 reasons. They were either really, really good and memorable or really bad, and you don't want to be the bad one. The good ones I remember because they just explained things so clear, and I don't really remember the specifics, but I remember that they did a great job. And the bad ones, I remember all the mistakes and how painful it was to read it. So you don't want to be on that side of the spectrum. And again, you can highlight or draw attention to important information wherever you can in your narrative. You can achieve that by using bulleted or numbered lists to make important points, and use tables if you can too. Like I said, I like these in the evaluation plan. It just makes everything easier to understand for your reviewers. The evaluation plans, I've seen some very well-written evaluation plans, but they were presented completely in a narrative fashion and were several pages long, but all narrative and just no bullet points, no tables or anything like that. That just understanding that itself and taking that section apart and trying to make sure that it was a good plan when it's presented that way can take 2 hours, and that's time that's now cutting into other applications. So it can be, it could have been put together so much easier in a way that could have been read in 15 minutes, but it wasn't. So again, make things easier on your reviewers' eyes. And just to kind of summarize the goal here in formatting proposals, you want to make things easy on the eyes of your reviewers. You want to emphasize your important points, and you're doing this because you're helping your reviewers make connections. Making those connections will help them understand what you're doing. There's nothing worse than reading through a 200-page proposal with tables and attachments and everything else and getting to the end of it and thinking to yourself, I don't even know what they're doing. And then having to go back and read through this again and try to understand it. It should be abundantly clear what it is that the applicant wants to do. Of course, all of this advice that I'm giving you is going to really come down to what the grant maker wants. This is going to vary from, there's going to be a lot of variability from the federal side of things as compared to the private funding sources. But what you really want to keep in mind is that you always want to make sure you're following their guidelines. But even within their guidelines, some of these tips should be helpful for you because overall what you're trying to do is present the clearest and most concise picture and description of what it is that you want to do. And how you style things, how you format your presentation is all going to either help or slow down the process, and you really want it to help the process. I'm going to give you a couple of, you've got a couple of examples that I sent to you. Actually, let's look at the tool that I sent to you first before we take questions here. it's titled Proposal Alignment Checklist, and it's a table. It says list of objectives and then need, description, evaluation, budget. And I developed this tool as a way to help write good objectives, and I did that with another group in another webinar that I did a couple of months ago. But this is still a good tool to help you in trying to see how well aligned your sections are. And as I said, it's something that I use as a reviewer to make sure everything's lining up. So this tool would be useful in a situation like that where you want to review your own work and see if things are lining up. So you're welcome to use that tool, but I want to show you a couple of examples then too, and maybe as a group then you can see, I guess these are some of the more obvious mistakes that I've seen. If you look at example 1, there's one handout that has 2 examples in it, and if you look at example 1, at the top it says quality of the project design. This would be a perfect example of probably one of the most vague / weak proposals I've read in a long time. And I provide an explanation for the comments that I made then on page 2. If you look at the vague language here, one goal will be, one objective under this goal will be, a large population of students are considered at risk. Another objective under this goal. Well, as a reviewer, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, so how many objectives are there, or how many goals are there? They never really spell it out. They don't provide a bullet list anywhere, or a numbered list, or anything. This one page that I included, that I pulled from this application and included here, is pretty much how the entire narrative read. Nothing visual for the reviewers to take any cues from, and it just kept saying, every goal that was referred to said, one goal, and then the same with the objectives. So by the time you got to the end of this, you really didn't know how many goals there were. It was just that vague. A large number of students are considered to be at risk. Well, how many? I mean, that's data you should have. Let's see. There were spelling and grammar errors littered throughout this thing. I've never seen points deducted for that kind of thing, but it does just kind of look bad when you're a school and you're applying for Department of Ed funding and you're not getting things spelled correctly in here. My comment on the effective methodology, if you get about halfway through the example 1, I was confused with this one. It said that they wanted to have some sort of word of the month that they are going to encourage students to emulate around the school and work them into classroom lesson plans. I don't know. I'm not an expert in drug prevention, but I don't know how effective placing words around the school are going to be in preventing that. So, and they don't provide any kind of rationale as to why that strategy is going to work. But they did cite a couple of sources. USA Today, Highlights for Children, and Disney. You can imagine how I felt about the credibility of those sources. Those would not be what I consider expert sources. And then finally on this one, they mentioned that they're going to reward students who are showing certain characteristics. And it's just a basic evaluation question here. Well, what do you consider demonstration of those characteristics? How are you measuring that? Bigger question, how are you measuring your impact? But they didn't really mention that either. This, just in general, this was very, very, very weak. Moving to the next one, this one will forever stay with me, example 2. This entire narrative was written as a play. And interestingly enough, maybe ironically, it wasn't to fund a school drama program. It was actually for mental health counseling. I'll say right at the top here that for this particular program, over 900 applications made it to the review round, which means there were probably somewhere close to between 1,500 and 2,000 applications submitted, so very competitive. 900 made it to the application round, and of those 9, they only had funding for 9 schools. So just under 1% of those that made it through the review process got funding. So very, very, very competitive. And to completely deviate from the formatting guidelines and just do your own thing will pretty much guarantee you won't be funded, because when you reach a level of competition as high as this was, where you're only going to fund 1% of the applicants who get through the review part, out of a total of 100 points possible, I'm going to guess that those 9 schools that were funded probably all scored perfect 100s, and there were probably some other 100s that didn't get funded. So every point lost in this review was probably the difference between funding and not being funded. So to deviate from the application guidelines to this extreme was pretty interesting. Pretty interesting approach on their part. It did make it nearly impossible to read this, though. This should have taken 2 hours. It took at least 6. And what will really aggravate a reviewer is that a lot of times, at least with these federal programs, we don't just get to assign you a score for a section and then move on to the next one, but we have to provide a written rationale for why we gave you that score, including citations and examples, page numbers, that kind of thing. So we still have to work all the way through that application, and if you're not putting information where it should be or in any kind of order that we can understand, we're flipping back and forth all over to try to find where something might have been and list it as being out of order, or it was, the data wasn't strong enough, that kind of thing. So it's not as simple as just scoring a question and saying you didn't do very well on that question and moving to the next one. So it can be a very, very lengthy process then with that taken into consideration, because we're still looking for whatever answer is so we can comment on it. Yeah, so suffice to say that neither of these were funded. I think the first one scored somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 points, and the second one might have beat it by 6 points with a 22, but they weren't very impressive in terms of the overall score and then how happy they made their reviewers. So those are examples of things you never want to do. One thing that I will often do with my own grant proposals, knowing how reviewers are picked, I'll put my applications together and just run it through my secretary and see if she can give her a day to look at it and see if she can come back to me and tell me what she thought of it. I don't expect her to completely understand it, but we work in a nonprofit agency, social services, so she has some idea of what we're doing. So she knows some of the jargon, she knows some of the programming terms. She should be able to read through it and about 80% understand what's going on or what we're intending to, what we're proposing and intending to request funding for. If she comes back at me scratching her head and says, this makes no sense, I don't understand what you're up to, then I ask her to sit down and tell me why. What did I do wrong? It's very helpful when you can have somebody who's not quite a total layman, but not involved in writing the grant either, review that for you and give you a little bit of feedback. With that, I'm going to turn it over to questions then and see if anybody has any questions about the presentation.
Thanks, Scott. If any of you have questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat box and we'll read them off and answer them, or you can raise your hand and press star 6 to unmute star 7 to unmute your line. Again, if you have a question, feel free to either raise your hand and dial star 7 to unmute your line, or enter them in the chat box. You can also email Scott at his email address, which is scott@justright-solutions.com, if you have questions after the webinar. Corey is asking if is it good to include a table of contents?
That usually depends on the funder. Most federal applications require that, and just depending on whether they require you to submit it electronically through grants.gov or hard copy, some of them still do that, will determine how you do that. I think with grants.gov, as you upload things into that system, it creates a table itself for you. If you're looking at private foundations, I would say look at your application guidelines, and if it's a lengthy application and it doesn't really say, if it doesn't tell you that you should, but it doesn't really tell you shouldn't, that can be helpful. At least, it helps the reviewer know where to find things. And again, it's an extra navigational tool. So I think if it's more than 15 pages in length total, and maybe you have a lot of appendices or something, or attachments, it's not a bad idea to throw a table of contents in there, as long as it's not going to cause a problem for them. I've not seen too many private funders require it, and a lot of the private foundations that I submit requests to are pretty short proposals, like under 10 pages and a few attachments. So it's not something I've really done, but I think if it got to be lengthy, I would do that, just because it would make things easier for the reviewers to locate. And that's really the bottom line, is that you want to make the information easy to find.
And another question, the use of tables, do federal grants allow them?
Again, that will depend on the department and the grant itself. If you look through the RFP and you don't see anything that says you can't use it, then sometimes it's a good idea. I'm working on one right now, as a matter of fact, that it doesn't. It strongly hints in a few sections that you can organize data by tables, and that's a good way to present information. It's very good for comparisons, I think. I'm looking at the information that I'm working on presenting right now is within the needs section, and we are writing a grant to expand the capacity for healthcare services for a specific population. So we're trying to make the case that population has a greater need than the general population. So we list, we have a table with, I think, 5 or 6 rows, and we list in each row major morbidities, like the prevalence rate of heart disease, cancer, high cholesterol, diabetes, some of those big ones. And in the first column, we know what the prevalence rate is for our population, and then in the second column, we're comparing that. We're listing the prevalence rates for the county level. So the general population, which is also, it's a very localized stat. So you're looking at the general population within a county compared to our specific population, which is also located in that county. And the population we're working with is actually anywhere from 3 to 5 times higher with prevalency rates. So that's a great way to make that information stand right out there and demonstrate your needs. So we provide a couple of paragraphs of narrative information describing that problem, and then we provide a table that, boom, right there it is. I mean, you can't miss it, and I think it makes a pretty powerful statement. So, and according to the federal guidelines that we're working under, like I said, it actually sort of it encourages the use of tables. So some will and some won't, and if they don't say anything at all, what I would do with the federal grants, at least, is make sure that you contact whatever person, whatever contact they list there, and find out if that's okay. My guess is it usually would be. They're not. I haven't had problems with them not liking tables.
Thank you. Looks like there's no more questions in the chat box. If any of you have any more questions, here's a question. It looks like Charity asks, what's your opinion about applicants including a less than one-page case story, even though the RFP does not ask for it? Example, a HUD grant. Question from grant manager at regional agency providing free legal assistance.
I guess it would. It's going to depend on what your case story is about and how relevant it is. I don't know that I would actually separate it. What I might try to do is integrate that into the narrative itself. Again, don't do it in such a way that you're replacing good quantifiable data, but I guess kind of cut it down to the smallest you can get it and maybe sprinkle pieces of it throughout the needs section, or provide maybe a one-paragraph example of the case that you're trying to make. There's a really good book, and maybe Kelly, you might know the title because I think GPA sells it, or maybe they don't. Grant, what is it? Storytelling.
Storytelling for grant.
Something like that. Yes.
It's by Cheryl Clark.
Yes, exactly. That's a good book that will give examples on how you can work those stories into your grant narratives. I don't think I'd actually separate it out though, because if you separate it out, it may not even get read. I mean, frankly, as a reviewer, we're tasked with reading the narratives, not the attachments. So if you're throwing good information into the attachments or into your appendices, it may not get read at all. So try to sprinkle it into your narrative where you can, if it really does support your needs statement pretty well. I think, Charity, you also mentioned something about photos. Photos, on the other hand, I would stick those or I would keep those limited to the appendices and only if they're asked for. Those are generally kind of, media type things are generally pretty frowned on unless they really ask for them. I had an applicant a couple of years ago who, explicitly this grant competition says not to, provide media or anything else, just follow the guidelines, your hard paper proposal, that's it, with the attachments listed. And these folks put together a very nicely bound presentation for us, including DVDs, just all kinds of things that we were promptly instructed by our review chairperson to pull the narrative out of all of that and literally throw the rest away. You're not to look at it. We're not even allowed to consider that, look at it, any of it. So before you go overboard with lots of neat stuff or even a picture, there's a good chance that it won't even be viewed by reviewers unless they specifically ask for it, so I wouldn't go that far.
Okay. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to email Scott at justright-solutions.com. That concludes our webinar. We'd like to ask each of you to remain with us a few moments longer and complete a short survey. Please take a moment to evaluate the webinar and provide GPA with topics for future webinars. Thank you to our presenter, Scott, for his time and willingness to share his information and expertise. Also, thanks to all of you who have attended. We're glad that you could join us and hope that the session was helpful for you. Later today, you will receive a recorded version of the webinar. Please take the time to visit our the GPA website and the calendar on there to view our future webinars in 2012. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Thank you. Please stand by.